just to kind of dovetail on that a little bit, I just came back from a national conference where for the first time ever I got to speak at the national level, and besides being scared witless, you know, one of the things that the host of the conference said at the very end, in similar vein, is a lot of people have a story to tell. And if you think you want to tell a story, don't be afraid to. If you're looking to people to encourage you to submit a proposal and do those things, do it. This community in particular has been super supportive of me doing it, and I will certainly offer my willingness to encourage anybody who thinks they have something to say and want to get up on the stage and do it, because everybody has great ideas. Just the conversation that took place towards the end of the last presentation was indicative of that. So a lot of people have some great ideas. So I would say, if you're thinking about it, jump in. You never know what'll happen, and usually you'll walk away with a pretty great experience. So we're going to talk about identity and access management. And I'll very briefly kind of give you my safe harbor slide. Background, I've been in and around identity management for about the last 22 years. They, of course, didn't call it that back then. That's really kind of a modern creation of about the last 10 years. Currently, I work in IAM for Merck & Company. I wear a lot of different hats. I'm also a volunteer high school speech and debate coach. That does not come with any warranty or guarantees as to my performance today. Hopefully my students might see this video and go, oh, hey, the old man actually knows what he's talking about, but we'll see how that goes. But most importantly, the opinions expressed here, even though I do work for Merck, are my own. So in case it's not obvious from the previous picture, I have two passions in life. One, obviously, is digital identity. That's why I'm up here talking to you guys. The other is my horses. And it's pretty rare that those worlds intersect, but within the last month, I had what can only be best described as a self-inflicted teachable moment related to my horses that I think is particularly instructive for today's discussion. My wife and I live in Charlotte, and we are blessed to have a very small horse farm. And periodically, we let our horses graze on our very small pastures. We can't let them out there full time because they would overgraze it quickly. So when we do that, the horses have to pass through a series of gates in order, very much like in the enterprise, in order to access their data, grass. And in that process, obviously, we're doing so to make sure that they don't wind up in places they aren't supposed to be. So one day, last month, I did not securely lock one of the gates. And the littlest one there got out. And like most breaches, I was not the one to find this out. My neighbors were. And that followed by a phone call to my wife, followed with a phone call to me. And let me tell you, that is not a conversation I would wish on anybody. The good news is we were able to get Pony back. She's safe and sound. Yes, her name is actually Pony. However, I have nicknamed her Dropbox now because DLP is kind of a little weird. So what does all this have to do with digital identity management? Well, connecting the dots a little bit, in particular with identity management, but it's in some respects true of security in general. Identity is only as good as the people, processes, and the tooling that you use in order to secure your enterprise. And any one of those legs fails, in my case, locking the gate, and you can have a breach or a horse running around. And so what we'll talk about in the identity management world is, trying to engage in these programs is usually very complex. So I'm going to try and unpack it a little bit. This is going to be a little bit of a general talk, but I'm going to go through a lot of the different areas or disciplines within identity management. And I deliberately have crafted this to allow for deviations or deeper dives. So if there's particular areas that you're interested in, by all means, please speak up. So what we'll do is initially kind of unpack what identity management is. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the most recent breaches, but it's going to be done specifically with respect to the identity layer. And then, we'll also talk about the types of identity management programs you can engage in. We'll talk about some of the latest developments in identity. There is help on the way. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the adoption approaches you can take. What are those keys to success? And then I'll finally talk about a note on security versus opportunity. So why identity? Hopefully most people recognize this because it's a classic identity confrontation. You're getting challenged by 3 questions before you can cross this bridge. The reason why identity, and part of this was alluded to in the previous talk, although not directly, and that's one of the reasons why I enjoyed the previous presentation so much, is you're looking at where your threats are. And the business doesn't always understand where those threats are. And one of the areas of threat, without question, is identity. And I'll talk specifically with that with respect to the breaches. Does this look familiar? And I don't mean that specific site. This was actually at a conference that I attended. And I've invented an acronym for this. I have no idea if it's unique, but it's YALR, and it's yet another login or registration. And that's one of the things that is probably our biggest challenge in the identity world. And you guys all feel this. How many of you, just curious, use password managers? Probably a good share of hands. I checked my 1Password account the other day, and I'm up to about 254 logins. Some of those will work, a good chunk of those will work, but not all of them. And that's probably not even all inclusive. But that gives you an idea of the scope of what we're dealing with is, simplifying this world is a huge challenge. One of the arguments that has come up, I would say in the past 3 years, it was actually invented by a gentleman from General Electric named Dan Hedrick, who at the time it was a very good idea. It was the concept that, with the expansion of where everything is moving, not just in the enterprise, but in the world, identity is really your new perimeter for controlling access to things. And there is some soundness to that, but my argument is you can't talk about things anymore in terms of perimeters. The perimeter's gone. The idea of the old days where you have the castle and the moat, and you have that solid perimeter of detection, and you can control who gets in and who doesn't get in, is gone. You've got users that are accessing or demanding access to data from any device at any time in any place using a variety of means. So the picture on the right is a little closer to that. The good news is that there is a control out there that can assist you in that effort, and obviously, the reason I'm up here is I think identity is one of them. So now we're going to talk about a few breaches, and I actually updated this yesterday because of some recent news that came out actually on Friday that just made my blood boil. This was not the one, but I'm going to start with the IRS breach. Everybody pretty much familiar with what happened there for the most part. IRS decided to launch a user-friendly service that would allow you to get your tax records. Concept, it's a great idea. The problem was they were using knowledge-based authentication in order to initially enroll the user. And unfortunately, they were using information that was pretty easy to social engineer or even just simply search for on Google in order to find a person. You could set up a trial account on Ancestry.com and probably find out a lot of the things you need to do. What that resulted in was roughly about 100,000 taxpayers had their, not their identities compromised, but really to set the stage for identity compromise. I just refinanced my house, so I paid particular attention to this, but looking at the full detail of my 1040, you have a lot of information that can be used to steal someone's identity. And that's ultimately what these guys are facing. And some of the other breaches, they're facing even worse. Ironically, when this feature came out, I was one of the first people, being an identity geek, I'm wanting to go kick the tires and see what the IRS is doing, or more importantly, not doing right. And so I created an account. That was, ironically, the easiest way to protect yourself, because you already had the identity created, so the hackers couldn't come in and create that identity. Now, could they compromise my identity? Sure, but that process is a little trickier than just simply using some basic knowledge. So obviously that's a huge challenge for the 100,000 people that were impacted by this, and I would argue that that number is even higher because those are the filings, which oftentimes are joint returns if you happen to be married, so it's more than 100,000 taxpayers. And obviously Anthem has already been mentioned, but I want to lay this one with the identity context as well. Actually, I want to back up just one second. With respect to the knowledge-based authentication, I don't know how many of you have experience with that, but oftentimes when you're applying for credit or you're applying for particularly sensitive credentials, they will try and use knowledge-based authentication. It's stuff that you should know. An easy example of that is they may send you a list of addresses and they'll say, which one of these did you live on? And they may not even have a valid address in there, and of course the answer is none of the above. That's the type of things that they can do. That is an inherently brittle way of authenticating users. Unfortunately, it has to be used sometimes in the digital world because you don't know who that person is at registration time. And that was the challenge that the IRS faced was, we want to roll out this great service to allow your average taxpayer to get their return and be able to print out those records, especially when they get audited, right? And unfortunately, they failed because of the brittle nature of that, so they had to pull the service offline. So when you are looking at using knowledge-based authentication, especially within your enterprise, pay attention to how those services implement that. We use a service that I won't name because I don't try and focus on vendors in this space, but their KBA questions are terrible. I mean, any of the ones that are pre-canned KBA questions are often terrible. There are things you don't want to answer, like where were you born? You know, that's not hard to find out from somebody if you're trying to hack their account. So if you can avoid KBA, please do. But if you're forced to do it, allow the user to create their own questions, because oftentimes they can come up with that. The challenge with that is the user has to remember even the answer to those questions. And I actually had a colleague, true story, just joined the company, and my job was to train him. And one of the first things I told him, I said, you know, go to our password management site, because what's the #1 reason for people calling the help desk? Password reset, or password changes, or my account's locked out, whatever it is. Passwords. So I said, first thing do, go to the site, do your thing. 2 days go by, I have another session with him, and I say, well, did you set up your profile? He says, no. He says, I can never remember the answer to those questions, so I just didn't bother to fill it out. If an information security guy won't fill out that program, how are you going to expect regular users to do it? That's the challenge we run into. So now let's talk about Anthem. It's now being called officially the largest PII breach in history, not just US history, but history. 78 million users or insured records, or put the math to that, 1 in 4 Americans, insured adult Americans, I should say. That's a staggering number. And the good news was the actual medical records, I don't believe, were part of that breach. So the medical history, at least according to Anthem's official what happened statement, they didn't get the actual medical history on the users, which is particularly sensitive data. But it's still obviously staggering in terms of the impact. And that's why so many people are able to raise their hand. Somebody even commented that they got a letter from Anthem. How did they get in? And this is where we start talking about identity. First of all, they fished into the front door. Real simple. They tricked somebody using, and this was particularly clever, they used a dupe of the wellstone.com website. Instead of the 2 L's in Wellstone, they put numbers. So even if the user was trying to be, somewhat, prudent in looking at the URL going to that website, if you're not paying super close attention, or if you have my eyes, you might miss the fact that that's going to a site with 2 1s in the number instead of 2 L's. Anyway, it asked them to provide their credentials in order to get into the site. So that's how they kind of got in the front door. Once they got in, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but classic kill chain methodology, they're looking to escalate privilege. Because there's a good chance the insured that they just got in with, or the user they just got in with that system may not necessarily have the type of access that they want to do to execute the breach. They're looking for something to elevate access. Compromise of credentials is the #1 way in which that happens. The good news in this scenario, and I don't think it gets enough attention, in response to this particular breach, and I think part of it was because of the size of it, Anthem started sharing their threat intelligence with other healthcare companies. And this is something that for a long time companies have been unwilling to do, and I'll be honest, it's true even in the pharmaceutical sector as well, because we're a we're all rivals. We may be collaborating on different types of drugs and whatnot, but we tightly control what they get access to. And so even the threat intelligence might be information that might cause one guy to get breached and not the other guy. And you think, oh, well, that's a competitive advantage. Well, we've finally gotten past that stage and say, look, we're all in this together. So the groups HITRUST and NHISAC, which are both healthcare-related security organizations, have worked with these various members of that organization to start pooling and sharing that threat intelligence. And to me, that's an important milestone because that begins to, it's not going to level the playing field, but it at least gives companies a good heads up on what's coming. And this was the big update to my slide deck from yesterday. I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with what happened with the Office of Personnel Management. But as a US taxpayer, and I suspect all of you in this room are probably taxpayers in some form, this was just staggering. Now, I'll be the first one to admit, this is not full in terms of we don't have the forensics yet to understand how much of an identity layer there is on top of this, but I do want to talk about a couple of pieces related to that. The first one is their HR department, or the Office of Personnel Management, which is basically the HR department for the largest employer in the United States. They were not encrypting Social Security numbers at rest. I don't know what other PII wasn't being encrypted at rest, but that's a basic principle of security. Now, to be fair, encryption does not completely protect you. They can decrypt that data potentially, but at least make it a little harder. The piece that came out yesterday that just really blew my mind was the SF86 database was breached for the second time. And what that database is if you are a federal employee and you are required to have a security clearance, there is a 127-page form that you have to fill out that you're pretty much pouring out your entire life on there. If somebody wanted to compromise you, that is the key to your castle, because they're going to find out your tax returns, they're going to find out what financial institutions you work with, they're going to find out what foreign nationals you communicate with on a regular basis, they're going to find out your drug history, your financial history in terms of like if you've had bankruptcies. It's a Bible on your life, effectively. And that database was breached, as I said, for the second time. It actually happened previously last year. The first layer of impact in terms of the 4 million current and former employees, that's devastating by itself. That's 4.1 million people who just got pantsed in the public sector in terms of their ability to interact and do transactions. But the SF86 breach really put a lot of people at risk, and frankly put our country at risk. Because one of the commentary, part of the commentary that's been coming out of this is, if China was in fact the country that did this, and the evidence appears to be strong, but again, the government saying what they're saying, do you trust them, do you not? But if in fact it was the Chinese government, you now have a large amount of data to manipulate an individual to do things that ordinarily they wouldn't want to do. And so the ability to turn people into spies, and that sounds very Tom Clancy-esque, but that's the reality of what this happened. Now, the one good news was most CIA personnel wasn't part of this database. It's actually a separate entity, but it's still federal government employees that have a high security clearance. Oh, by the way, that includes NSA employees. Just something to bear in mind. One of the things that I thought that was particularly interesting was the Office of Personnel Management did not have a security department until 2013, which just, really? Is that the era that we live in? And the other thing I thought was staggering as well is in order to externally access their network, they did not have to provide any second factors of authentication. So any device anywhere could get into that network with a single compromised credential. So you can probably guess what the forensics report's going to look like when they come back and they say, how did they get in? Pretty straightforward. As I've noted here, and it's going to be linked on the slides, and one thing I did want to say, I will make the slides available on SlideShare after this talk tonight. The Wired article that I linked in there is a must-read on the breach, and there's going to be much better journalism that takes place, but the Wired article at least frames a lot of this, some of which I've frankly borrowed a little bit in terms of the talk, but it's just a good primer on it, and it's a good thing to be educated on. The other thing I thought that was interesting, and you guys obviously already read it by now, they didn't find this out by one of their administrators or the Secret Service knocking on their door. They were getting a demo from a vendor that found this breach taking place. And of course, the vendor at this point, I can't even remember their name at the point, it's actually mentioned in the Wired article, they've got to be going, cha-ching, you know, you can't get better advertising than that. And that's obviously bittersweet because there's millions of people that are going to be impacted by this. And that's the thing that just makes my blood boil about it is we should be expecting better OPSEC from our government on that. Obviously, Ed Snowden proved that we don't have very good OPSEC to begin with, but you should expect, being a public employee, that they're going to protect your data better. And as a taxpayer, we should be expecting that as well, because as the IRS just proved, they're not doing such a good job either. So what does all of this tell us? Well, the first is the threat landscape obviously is changing daily. That's one of the reasons why I picked those breach examples, is they've all happened in the last 6 months. As I mentioned early on, the elevation or compromise of privileged access is a key stage in 100% of all attacks, and that may be coming out a little bit dark, but it's 100%. That's from the Cybersheath report. This is basically the critical attack vector out there. This is why identity, basically. The recent Verizon data breach investigation report basically said that 100% of the data breaches involve the use of compromised credentials, whether it's getting that privilege escalation or getting in the front door through a phishing attack. So before we start talking about identity management as a whole and drilling into some of the programs, it probably helps to kind of lay the groundwork as to what identity management is. And I'm borrowing a Gartner definition that is adequate, but obviously we'll overlay some context to kind of broaden the definition a little bit. And it's a set of business processes and supporting infrastructure for the creation, maintenance, and use of digital identities. And I promise that'll be the last slide that I actually read off of. But one of the things I like about the definition is the first word that comes out is processes. And that's a piece that in security we don't talk enough about. As with the gate with my pony, as with the gates within your company, how people get access to systems and the gates that they go through are often the weakest links in that equation. And part of it's because you've got human beings doing the work with them. You can put all the IDSs and IPSs and firewalls out there in the world, but if you don't have people operating those gates appropriately or approving accessing those gates appropriately, you're at risk. Ultimately, identity management is about user, time, device, and location, and that list is not meant to be exhaustive, but what it creates is a context. And the good news is that's actually helping us in the war in securing identities, is our knowledge of what a user is doing, and more importantly, what they should be doing or what should be normal, is improving dramatically, and I think that's going to help us long term, and I'll talk about a little bit about that when we talk a note about authentication. So these are the 4 programs, and plus a note at the bottom, that are typically mentioned when we talk about reducing risk within an identity and access management program. The first one's user management and provisioning, then entitlement management, privileged access management, which was actually the talk that I gave last year, and we'll spend a little bit of time on that. Federation, both in terms of provisioning and single sign-on, and then finally I'll talk a little bit about authentication. Provisioning is what most people think identity management is. It's the process of getting a user that, a new employee walks into your company, you get them their network ID, you get them access to particular systems, and it's the processes that goes on behind that to, CRUD, create, update, delete that user's access. Oftentimes you'll get attributes or authoritative sources from many different places. HRIS systems are typically the most common one, but when you're dealing with partners, they may be coming from other sources as well. Ultimately, within that piece, the processes, as I've mentioned, are what drives the events around it. An employee entering the organization, or you may have a new contract with a partner. In the case of Merck, we may have a new contract with a clinical research organization that's going to conduct a trial for us, testing a particular pharmaceutical effectiveness. Those processes will vary based on the types of users in your organization. Key protocols and standards that are related to this, Obviously, LDAP is a very common one. SPML I won't spend a lot of time on because frankly it's old and a lot of people avoid using it, and that's frankly for good reason. Skim is an emerging standard, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, and then there's also the WS star spectrum of protocols that are used for that as well. Entitlement management is sometimes referred to as access control or access management, and what it is it's kind of another tier of provisioning. It's, okay, I have an ID, now what can I get access to? And sometimes it can be as mundane as just adding a user to an Active Directory security group, or it could be policy-based, where you're evaluating an attribute of a user within their organization to determine if they have access to something. Oftentimes this is kind of described as the next phase of maturity for companies that are getting into the identity management space, because you want to, now you know, okay, they have easy access to things, they're able to get into doing their job. Now what do they have access to and how can we manage and control that? And key protocols within this area, SAML is one of them with respect to what we call the just-in-time provisioning profile. And I'll talk a little bit more about SAML on the Federation side. SPML is mentioned again, also WS star. EXACML, which stands for the Extensible Access Control Markup Language, which is a mouthful, is also key here. I would also include OAuth in here, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, and then obviously LDAP as well. Privileged access management is kind of that next tier of maturity of your identity management program. Obviously, the name is kind of self-intuitive. It's really focusing on those identities in your enterprise that have the proverbial keys to the castle. Where those keys are, though, I would encourage you to kind of have a holistic perspective. A good example of that, one of the breaches that I used to talk about was at Saudi Aramco. An insider found out he was about to get laid off, and he happened to have the insider knowledge that every single one of their PCs was controlled by the same local admin password. So he executed a script to wipe 30,000 hard drives of all of their PCs. So most people don't think of that as a privileged account because it's not a critical system account in the server, client server sense. But it also manages what your client can do. And when you get into the malware space, if they don't have the ability to execute malware, oftentimes you prevent that malware from even taking a foothold in the workstation. So it's one of the things to think about. Within Privileged Access Management, or PAM, the focus really is on auditing and compliance and what controls you have in place. Who has access to this system? How did they get that access? Who approved it? What did they do while they have it? If they have root access to a Linux system, what commands are they executing? And that's where you get into, the key use cases within this space are password vaulting and session management and recording. That list is by no means exhaustive. But that's the traditional one. So you go to your privileged access management system, you check out that password, you log into the system, do what you need to do, you check that account back in. As I stated at the bottom, this is a critical area for modern enterprises. As we've already talked about with respect to the breach, this is where privilege escalation can happen. It's not the only method of achieving it. Obviously, a SQL injection can sometimes achieve the same benefit, but the easiest way is to compromise a privileged identity. And if you have a mature privileged access management program, it's not going to prevent somebody from getting onto your network, but it might slow them down or discourage them in terms of what they do, and they might eventually give up, we hope. One note on this with respect to cloud. Vendors are still struggling with this a little bit. There's a couple of vendors that are targeting cloud systems in particular, for example, Amazon. So if you have infrastructure as a service, if I took a poll in here, I suspect there would be a majority of people saying that our company has some instances on Amazon or other cloud service providers. One of the challenges with the enterprise privileged access management systems is their ability to talk to those identities and, for example, change their passwords when their sessions are complete is not quite there yet. I think APIs are going to be the key to that, and the vendors are recognizing that, but they're not quite there yet. You do have some specialists in that space, but oftentimes what you wind up doing is, for larger enterprises, you wind up buying an enterprise PAM tool, and then you buy the cloud tool to supplement it. Hopefully those guys are going to converge at some point. The one thing I will comment on this, and this was a theme in my talk from last year, is don't think in terms of just tooling, in that, especially if you're a small or medium business, well, I can't afford to do this. Don't think of it just in terms of tooling. You can adopt processes, again, getting back to that P word. You can adopt processes to manage your privileged identities that will continue to protect you better. It doesn't make it foolproof, but don't think just in terms of the tooling. Think of the processes that you can put behind that. Federation is a broad term. I'm not referring to Star Trek. Basically, it involves the creation, it's a reflection of the contracts that you have with outside vendors. And most of you, if you work in an average company today, probably have at least one federation connection. And what it's designed to do, and it's a good thing, is to prevent you having to memorize another credential to access an external or SaaS service. They're basically going to take my existence as Lance Peterman at Merck, and when I go to SuccessFactors, I'm still Lance Peterman at Merck. And instead of me having to, insecurely enter in a username and password, it's now going to pass a token to them in a much more secure format to reflect that trust relationship. And they're going to say, okay, I trust that this is Lance Peterman. Simple use cases. Single sign-on is probably the one that people can relate to. When I talk to people about identity management, that's usually what they sink their teeth into initially. But provisioning is also a part of this, and it's probably the trickiest aspect because it's the idea that, let's take, for example, Office 365. How many people use Office 365 or Google Apps? One of the challenges for the enterprise in that space is, well, how do I securely give my user access to that without either having to create a Microsoft Azure AD account or a Google account and have them memorize yet another credential? But more importantly, even if I am federating and allowing them to log in using their base company credential, how do I create that account in a timely fashion that gives them the access that they need when they need it? And that's what federation provisioning is attempting to do. Oftentimes this is occurring through, I think there's a vendor here today that has some libraries that allow you to do this. A lot of times this is through data synchronization, which is terrible. What you really want to shoot for is what they call JIT, or just-in-time provisioning. So if I'm a new employee and I'm going to Office 365 for the first time, it goes, oh, you're a Merck employee, I'll go ahead and create your account, and then I may, on the back end, have somebody provision the access for that user. With respect to access or entitlement management, this is where it can be getting a little tricky. That's one of the things that you want to think about if you're working with identity management and you're working with SaaS vendors is, how do I manage the life cycle of that user and their access to that system? The good news, if you're enabling federation, is if you disable the base account, the front door is closed for them to get access. That's the good news. The problem is if you're paying per user, you're still paying for that license until you remove it. And that can sometimes be a considerable cost savings or cost inhibitor, depending upon the number of users that you're talking about. As I mentioned, cloud is making this a little bit tougher. When I talk through the help is on the way part, we will get into that a little bit. The older provisioning standards for this, whether it's SPML, whether it's the WS Fed piece, they're brutal to implement, and vendors just simply haven't adopted them. And so one of the things within the identity management industry is they're trying to come up with better ways of doing this. They think they've achieved this with Skim, and I'll talk about Skim a little bit in a second. So a note about authentication. As long as passwords exist, and they're the most convenient way of authenticating a user, our systems are at risk. You guys know this. It's the most brittle aspect of system security. So I would encourage you within your enterprise, even if this isn't going to be your focus, when you're engaging with vendors, what other methods of authentication are they capable of supporting? Biometrics is becoming huge. Sometimes just the interaction with mobile device management from, I'll pick on Apple initially, with Touch ID. What other things can I do to identify a user than simply a password? Where are they logging in from? What device are they logging in from? Is their mobile device nearby? Can you detect that proximity? It's what we call contextual or continuous authentication. Those type of things over time, I'll admit, these aren't 100% here yet. There's a lot of vendors that will argue with me on that because they'll say we have a product we can sell you, and they may work. But in the enterprise, the ability to scale them, and scale is the challenge, they're not quite there yet. But I think this is going to be one of the key pieces to securing the enterprise better or securing users better. And just on a personal note, if you go to a service and they have multi-factor authentication available to you, use it. take advantage of it. Hopefully they've done it well, where you could use something like Authy or Google Authenticator or other common, obviously you don't want 15 different apps on your iPhone for doing multi-factor authentication, but if they have it available to you, take advantage of it, because the ability for a user to compromise your account is greatly diminished. It's not eliminated, but it is greatly diminished when you have multi-factor authentication. The good news is help is on the way, eventually. And I say that just because there are some standards that are emerging, but some of them haven't even been ratified yet. But they're coming, and I want you guys to have to be able to walk away with these standards, put them in your data dictionary, and so when you are talking with vendors or you're evaluating a product, what is their ability to support this? Even if they can't support it today, can they put it on their roadmap, or is it on their roadmap? Because that will give you a sense in terms of where the vendors are at in terms of thinking about security. We had a great conversation towards the end of the last talk about what can developers do to better secure their applications. What things can they think about? The number one answer I would give them in that space is don't create yet another login or registration for the user. Don't create another account if you can avoid it. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but put a price on that, because if you do, it makes it less likely for you to do it. It's going to make your app, first of all, easier to use, and second of all, more secure. So the first one we'll talk about is OAuth. More specifically, OAuth 2. This standard has been around for a few years now. It was around previously in a different version, but OAuth 2 I think was ratified about 4 years ago. The auth in it stands for authorization, not authentication. A lot of people confuse that because there is an authentication transaction that takes place within an OAuth flow, and if this were a longer talk, I would go through what that flow looks like. But it's important to distinguish that. Particularly when I talk about OpenID Connect. It gained a lot of maturity with the second release, but I will say it's more of a framework than a protocol. A protocol has a lot more maturity and control around it. You have a lot of flexibility with OAuth in terms of how you implement it, and as a result, you have a lot of flexibility with how securely you implement it, and that's part of the challenge. This really is becoming the vector for leveraging API security. So this is an area where if you are a developer, knowing OAuth will certainly be to your advantage. One of the things I do like about it is there's several RFCs that are tied to it. One of them is dedicated to itself as its own threat model. So this is the one that you can have developers take a look at and understand what are the typical threat patterns within this model to code against, and make sure it kind of provides you a not so brief best practices, excuse me. There's still a lot of great development going on within this standard, and I included the link there at the bottom. I've already mentioned Skim a few times. It has an unfortunate name for that acronym. It used to be a lot easier. It was Simple Cloud Identity Management, which is much nicer to say. The system for cross-domain identity management obviously is a little tougher, but they did that for a reason, and really it's designed to be for everything within the enterprise, not just simply managing identities in the cloud. This is basically the answer to the ginormous albatross that SPML was. It's much lighter, it's much more friendly, it's based on JSON instead of XML, and it's got a lot of promise. I call it an emerging standard because it is. Right now, the most mature spec is the 1.1, which has some gaps in it from an enterprise context. But the key challenge here is the low adoption rate. So this is, again, where I make the appeal to you guys with the companies that you work for or work with. If you're a software vendor, please take this appeal. Get Skim enabled in your product set, because long-term, it's going to make your life easier and your customers are going to be a lot happier. But what it ultimately allows you to do is have a means of communication with your federated system, whether it's out in the cloud or it isn't. And it can even be within your enterprise, but it gives you a common library to communicate user provisioning events. Create this user with these attributes, give them this level of access, and it can be customized. Every organization treats their org as though it's this unique snowflake. This allows for some of the unique snowflake pieces to it through some of the schema designs that you can do in the 2.0 spec. The 2.0 spec is in the process of being ratified, I think it's like literally weeks away from being official. But the good news is most of the visionary IAM vendors out there, like, well, I'm not going to throw their names out here. If you want to know, talk to me later. But they already know this, and they're already in compliance with the 2.0 specification because it's pretty much been locked. They just haven't ratified it yet. OpenID Connect. You know how I mentioned that OAuth doesn't have an identity layer, or it technically doesn't? This is what OpenID Connect is designed to do. It provides a transaction layer specific to identity, specific to authentication, that allows you to create what they call an ID token for the user. Within the OAuth pattern, you can present a token and it just says, I'm Tom. It doesn't say how I established that I'm Tom. The relying party is actually just trusting that that transaction took place. This is ultimately kind of viewed, there is some interoperability with SAML, so it could still be part of this profile, but ultimately it's designed to replace SAML. If you don't know what SAML is, it stands for Security Assertion Markup Language. It's part of the Federation Protocol stack. It's easily the most mature ways that your companies will federate today, but this is the next generation of it. It is fully ratified. It has a lot better mobile use cases in it, even though that's still completing a little bit. One of the things that I really like about OpenID Connect, especially because it's a profile of OAuth 2, one of the challenges with OAuth 2 is you don't really have a good cookbook that says this is the best way to implement this framework from a security perspective. There is now a certification model that was created by the OpenID Foundation for OpenID Connect that will allow your security vendors, if they're leveraging OpenID Connect, they can now certify themselves against that standard. So again, that's one of those conversations that you can have when the vendor says, yes, we support OpenID Connect. Are you certified? Or is the vendor that you're using to achieve that certified? It's a great way to measure them against. I would highly recommend getting this on your internal development roadmap, especially if you're using other methods of authenticating users today from a federation standpoint. You'll find that these libraries are very easy to use, and I'll put a little star on that. Nothing is, when you're coding users, it's never completely easy to use, but it's much easier, I guess it would be a better way. And then finally, there's the URL at the bottom of it. This is a slight plug for an organization that I am a part of. Is anybody in this room familiar with the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace? And nobody raised their hand, just in case you were wondering. And it saddens me a little bit, but I'm not blaming anybody because it's one of the most poorly publicized achievements, in my opinion, whatever your opinion of the Obama administration is. In 2011, President Obama signed this executive order, and the name is pretty evidential. It's designed around, and it's a very well-written document around creating a framework for allowing users, not just in the US, but really globally, to have more secure transactions online. And one of the groups that's an offshoot of this that was funded by the NISTIC initiative is the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group. And that's the group that I'm a volunteer member of. I'll admit I'm more of a lurker than a contributor because of my day job. But I would encourage anybody, even if you don't have the bandwidth to contribute, if you want to better understand what they're doing here, you can sit in the plenary sessions are open to anybody, and it's some pretty fascinating stuff going on here. The one thing I will say, this is not a national ID program because that's one of the most common misunderstandings with respect to NISTIC and IDESG. It's really a public-private partnership. It's looking at the big identity players out there today, or maybe an emerging identity player or identity provider, and saying, how can we create a trust framework that's not just isolated to single contract relationships, and how can we make it more global to where I could literally use, and I'm not going to say we're going to go to the utopia of I'll have a single username and password that I can use wherever I go. But if we can reduce 254 to maybe 5, that'd be a huge help, I think, and I hope everybody agrees with me on that. They have some really amazing pilots going on. The one that I want to mention is actually taking place in North Carolina with respect to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. If you're not familiar with that, that's the renaming of food stamps. And one of the challenges that the food stamps program has, and it's not unique to North Carolina, is getting people to enroll. They have to go into these regional offices in order to sign up. And especially in the rural areas of North Carolina, that could be cumbersome. So what they're doing in this pilot is most people have a driver's license. One of the problems is we can't take that driver's license into the digital world and have it be an identity. But what they've done, and I think this is pretty clever, is they have their own app for enrollment. So the irony is not lost on me, the idea that somebody who's enrolling for food stamps also happens to have a smartphone, but they're becoming that ubiquitous in our country. So for those that do, they can go to the website on their mobile device, and as part of the enrollment process, they will allow the user to take a selfie. And it's done in real time to avoid fraud, but they'll allow the user to take a selfie, and then what they do is they compare, using facial recognition, that face versus the face on their driver's license. And you'll be amazed with facial recognition technology how close they're getting to really identifying people. It's one of those Minority Report level type, both fascinating and creepy at the same time, pieces. But for these people who are having to do this and having enrolled in this is a huge convenience to them, because now that I've officially enrolled you, go back to the IRS breach. How did I identify that person? I relied on some public knowledge to do that. But if I'm able to take their driver's license and use a real-time photo of that person, the odds of a fraudulent transaction taking place there are greatly reduced. They're not eliminated. This is all about risk reduction, not risk elimination. So I think that's a pretty neat program. That's just one of the pilots that has been funded out of this initiative. They're taking place all over the country. But again, I think as security professionals, I think this is an area that I hope this will pique some interest for you. And even if you're not going to the plenary sessions, pay attention to what's happening in that space. And they actually hired a PR firm finally to kind of broadcast the message a little bit better. We know in the security world, we do a terrible job of telling our success stories. Usually the stories that show up are the failures, the Sonys, the Anthems, the Targets of the world. And the link at the bottom is there. So what are some keys to success with any identity management program? The first and most obvious one is, if you're going to do this, have support from your senior leadership. Because some of these pieces, not all of them, the good news with identity management is oftentimes you're making lives easier. When you're doing single sign-on and you're telling a user, you know what, I already know who you are, so I'm going to let you into this website. I'm not even going to make you use your username and password. They love that. That's the happy story with identity management. The pain in the butt is with PAM, oftentimes, and other controls that you put in place. But if you have that senior leadership support, and it is driven by policy, and I can't stress this enough, if you don't have policies around the use of identities in your enterprise, if you can at all, please get them adopted. As I've mentioned this countless times, focus on the people and process first. The tooling will come, but the upside of focusing on people and processes first is that's going to drive a lot of your requirements, and then you can figure out if you're getting the right tool for those. Be creative with identity management. One size does not fit all. Enterprises come in big, small, medium, tiny, and you can use some of these tools at all of those levels. When you are looking at a vendor, look very closely at what their cloud capabilities are, because obviously everything is moving outward. And be picky on that. The other piece, don't be afraid to eat your own dog food first. Figure out what your user interface looks like for these tools if they are user-facing, and make sure that you're using them in the way that your users would use them, and that it's an experience that's pleasant for them. In the past, I'll be honest, identity tools have been terrible at UX. And so it's a painful experience. Even the password managers that are out there, with the security questions, the interfaces are brutal on them. They're finally getting better. And then finally, don't think you're too small for this. Even if you're a small business, look at where your risk is within the organization. That was a great thing that came out of the Shades of Red talk, was even if you don't have the funding to engage a red team to figure out how you're going to brutalize your enterprise, think about risk in your organization. Think about your business model and where is your risk at. And even if you can only tackle those small things to help mitigate that risk, you've done a tremendous service to your company. And as security professionals, that's ultimately what we're doing, whether this is within your discipline or not. And finally, a note on security versus opportunity. And really what this is meant to mean is the value proposition on identity and access management has changed. In the past, it's always been about two things, either single sign-on, which users love, or putting those processes in place behind the scenes that the users really don't pay attention to. It's those pay no attention to the man behind the curtain activities. That's really more classic security. People love that, you might have an intrusion detection system in your, company, or that you have great interfaces with your HR system to make sure that we revoke access in a timely fashion. But the only time they pay attention to it is when things go wrong or things break. Protection and risk management are obviously still the primary drivers, but as I mentioned with the OpenID Connect and the Skim and the OAuth pieces, identity can now be a little disruptive, especially for your external relationships. How many of you, and if you don't know this, it's okay, but when you have an interaction with an external customer, how many of you create an identity for that customer that you know of? Got a handful. That's the common model. That's what we do at Merck. And we're trying to, quote, get out of the identity management business. We're partnering with a vendor that they're becoming our main IDP so that they can manage that relationship. They can manage that proofing, because that's one of the big challenges with the users if you're trying to do more secure transactions. But that can be disruptive because, for example, with the strategic relationship we have at Merck, and this is probably the closest I'll give you to the inside baseball at Merck, one of the things we're trying to do is work with that vendor so that if they have that identity and they do business with Merck, there's a good chance that organization or that partner or that doctor or that clinical trial participant, they have a relationship with other members within the healthcare sector. Being able to use that same identity to go to each and every one of those vendors is a huge value add for the user. Because one of the biggest pain points, and frankly, we've lost business at times in terms of abilities, companies wanting to work with us, they may have to memorize up to 5 different credentials in order to access our various systems. And a lot of that goes on the vendor because they don't have federation enabled for their products. And as mature as SAML is a 15-year-old standard. And some of these vendors still haven't adopted it. That's where this can be disruptive because the user now has a single credential with some support to access any of the systems that they need to get to within my company. And whether it's hosted at my company or it's hosted at another provider. And that's where the opportunity is for you as security professionals, because when we reduce the number of credentials that the user has to do, yes, the attack surface reduced, but now we can also make how those credentials are used much stronger. You can't do that when you got 5 different credentials you have to secure. And with continuous and contextual authentication, we can now make that experience where it is much harder for a hacker to easily obtain a credential like they do with phishing attacks nowadays. That's it. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Could you address, if you're familiar, I'm sure, where identity or failure of processing identity came in with the CodeSpace breach a year and a half ago?
Oh, that's a great question. If you're referring to the company that I think of, CodeSpace was the company that went out of business because of the breach. This is a great cautionary tale, and I almost feel bad that I didn't use it in my talk. This was a company, CodeSpace, that all of their infrastructure was on Amazon. And somebody took the root Amazon credential and used that to delete every instance of servers for that company. And if you're familiar at all using Amazon Web Services, that does not take long to do at all. Now, are there backups? Sure. But what the company did in response to that was they took a look at what it was going to take to recover all of those instances and all of the data surrounding it. And they basically said the cost to do that is going to be higher than our cost to stay in business. And so they basically sent a note to all their customers and said, we're closing our doors. Now that's obviously an extreme example of what you're referring to, but that's the cautionary tale that identity provides if we don't adequately protect those identities. Anytime you have those keys to the castle, you have to protect those identities because that's what the hackers are going after. That's what the attackers want, is that elevation of privilege so they can really do the damage that they need, whether it's exfiltrating data or in this case, it was destroying data. So great question. Thank you for asking that. Any other questions? All right. My understanding is we have some prizes to give away.